How can that be? And what did that look like 70,000 years ago?
Yeah, thank you very much. The book is actually a very personal book for me also. It emerged out of some lectures that I gave at Oxford a few years ago because I wanted to put together thoughts, ideas, and practices of mine over the past 40 years. I've been advising governments in different parts of the world and have always had a very strong sense since I've been doing that, which is now 35 years of active advising governments, that probably the single most important question that one asks from any position on the globe is, how do I fit in to the rest of the world? In other words, the challenge of being part of a global economy and society is really the common reference point for almost every country in the world and almost every challenge that's faced. And I didn't know that at the beginning of my active advising work, which was back in 1985. It felt incredibly fresh and strange to me that there I was in La Paz, Bolivia, in the middle of the Andes, and everything was really a reference to how Bolivia fit into a broader world. A few years after that, I found myself in Poland uh, in the midst of the 1989 revolution. And while there were many dramatic things looking inward in Poland, to be sure, almost everything about the revolution, even the way that it was defined by the Solidarity leaders as a return to Europe, was a geographic concern.
Hmm.
And geography loomed very large. And then in Africa, where you and I have had a lot of experience in your great work with Kiva and in my work during the Millennium Development Goals, again, physical geography shaped economics and was determined by the state of technology. Could we fight AIDS? Could we fight malaria? How could one address some of these very geographically specific challenges that were looming large in development? Well, all of this is to say it took me a long time to understand this interaction of geography, uh,
Mhm.
technology, and institutions in any single place and in our modern period. But then the more I thought about it, the more I learned about it, the more I realized this was an eternal part of human history. If you go back to some of my now favorites of Aristotle's ancient Greece or other parts of the world at key moments of history, uh, it was similar considerations of the interactions of geography, of institutions and technology. So this was an attempt to uh, create a kind of approach or schema to looking at these challenges, and with the help of putting a date on
Mm.
critical periods of human history, starting, as you say, with the original dispersal of of modern humans, anatomically modern human beings, the us as our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, out of Africa, estimated to be about 70,000 years ago when the real migration took hold and spread to all the world. And when one looks from that first outward migration to today, it's been a story not only of a global settlement reaching all parts of the world actually pretty quickly after the dispersal from Africa, but also a history of long distance interaction. We've been moving, trading, exchanging ideas and technologies for as long as humanity has uh, been across the world. And my sense back in the 1980s, oh, we're watching the global economy take hold. Well, that could have been a sense throughout much of human history. Of course, things proceeded in a vastly slower pace before we had instantaneous communication, but it did proceed. And that really is the story that I'm telling in this book.
And you tell it very well, in a very entertaining way. As you know, my husband Reza, he says hello, and
Great.
I've kept shoving the book over to him as I was reading it at night, saying, "You got to read this part." And it led to some really interesting conversations about globalization. In particular, he pointed out a quote that I had remembered reading in one of his books before, but there's a definition of globalization, Roland Robertson's view, as quote, a concept that refers both to the compression of the world and to the intensification of a consciousness of the world as a whole. Just to kind of start with a pretty light, maybe fun question, at least for me, I was thinking, if it's about perspective and mindset as much as it is about logistics and actual reality of moving things and people around and being intertwined politically, being more connected technologically, I wonder if you think, I'm sorry, I'm going to turn off my notifications. I'm a little newer at this particular computer. I wonder if there was a period in time when people felt as connected. I know that we actually are instantaneous and we can be instantaneously connected with anyone, anywhere in the world. But I wonder, when do you think that happened first? Were there other cultures, other times when, just like you said, maybe we've had similar thoughts about how things have been progressing again and again in a cyclical way over time? When do you think that feeling that I am connected, my idea about myself, is set in this framework of feeling like we all live in one place. All of us human beings live on this one planet, and everything we do can affect anybody else. When do you think that kind of way of looking at things emerged,
I think
whether it was accurate or not?
yes, I think probably that idea of what the Greeks called the ecumen, which is the human settlement of all of space. They didn't know how far it would reach, but that's an idea in Herodotus in the 5th century BC, in the first histories, that there are peoples everywhere. There are peoples in Africa, there are peoples in Asia, there's us. Of course, the Herodotus is an amazing amalgamation of uh, remarkable first history, and also of a lot of the fantasies, the stories, the legends that were told, because so little was known about even 1,000 or 2,000 miles away. But the notion that there was a settled world, uh, not clear how large, was an idea that certainly dates back more than 2 millennia in a very active way. Long distance trade is a reality, of course, by the time of the Roman Empire, trading with China, not quite understanding what's on the other side, but histories of emissaries traveling very long distances, far before Marco Polo made his way to Cathay. We know that there were ideas about an interconnected world. Uh, there were not sharp, clear understandings of that world. But I think the next phenomenal breakthrough, of course, came with what Adam Smith called the two most significant events in the history of mankind. And I quote that part of Adam Smith's writing from The Wealth of Nations here, because it's such a striking, remarkable excerpt of his writing. But for him, the two most significant events in human history is Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492 and Vasco da Gama circling the Cape of Good Hope and making his way to Asia, linking Europe with seaborne uh, navigation and then trade at the end of the 15th century. This was completely mind blowing. This sense that, first of all, there was a new world that was not in the Bible. How can
Right.
that be?
Right.
We thought we knew the whole world. We thought we understood the world. And suddenly there's a whole new world of exploration. That shock alone may have been the most dramatic opening of the human imagination for ages when that happened. It triggered one after another, revolutions of thought in science, in humanities, in religion, in philosophy. It was shocking, but that was the time I think that there was the sense of the world that we know now as really being an interconnected world.
Mhm.
And within a couple of decades of those voyages, basically every aspect of thinking went wild. I'm deeply attracted to the decade 500 years ago now, that the decade of the 1510s and the
Yeah.
1520s, uh, completely revolutionary. Uh, it was the my favorite painting, which is Raphael's School of Athens, painted in his stanzas in the Vatican, uh, and Thomas More's Utopia, showing the idea of a new world opening up. Erasmus showing the new humanism, and Martin Luther uh, posting his 95 Theses on the cathedral door in Wittenberg. Uh, Add to that Machiavelli writing at the same time, and the first manuscripts of Copernicus's heliocentric theory of the world. Basically, within a few years, there was such an upheaval of thought, I think fundamentally because the whole world had opened up and there was a printing press to carry these new ideas all over Europe in an incredible explosion of writing and thinking. So that's a second clear moment. For me, a third clear moment that I would highlight is a remarkable essay of the remarkable philosopher Immanuel Kant in 1794 called Perpetual Peace. And Kant, this great philosopher of modernity and of the Enlightenment,
I did my
asked the
thesis
question,
on
there you
him.
go, asked the question,
Yeah.
what would it take to have global peace? And for
Mhm.
me, that is yet another step of this self realization. We are all in this together. What can we do to stop this fighting? And Kant gives a remarkable answer about a global society of republics, in effect, really giving the first idea of a world united in republicanism through international trade and out of the hands of the princes and the despots and the monarchs who send young men off to war. And soon after Kant was a similar conceptual piece of Jeremy Bentham, the inventor of utilitarianism, who basically invented the idea of international law, saying that we need a charter which guides global statecraft. Maybe the last next stage that I would say in your question about self realization is the iconic picture taken from space of the small blue planet when we see Earth from outside for the first time. I think that is also a completely mesmerizing and transformative moment, or at least it should be. Stare
Mhm.
at it, look at it, and if you think about Earth the same way again, maybe you're missing something in the picture. We are on this little speck. It is fragile. Of course, some people dream of going someplace else, but if we can't fix what's on our planet, we're not going to do much better trying to cross the cosmos for something better after we've wrecked this planet.
Yeah. It's sobering. I mean, I've often wondered, I'll talk to people who have gone to the same places, maybe even for the same-ish amount of time, and come back with different takeaways, different realizations. And I mean, something I'm a little bit obsessed with is what is the thing? And you have quote after quote, and I have all of my notes right here about, for example, okay, so for example, in the industrial age, you talk about how output per person in these 200 years, right? It grew 11x, and then poverty went from 90 to 10%. I mean, these amazing shifts, but yet we still have these remnants, these lingering big problems in the world, and there are threats coming up. And I think about, if only everyone thought this one thought, or knew this piece of information, or saw that beautiful picture of the earth, or what would it look like? And I guess kind of paired with this, I'm not asking you to, what's the answer, what's the big sweeping answer there, although maybe I'll get to it later. But I guess I've been thinking a lot, as I've read, you talk about human activity and output, and you could talk about output, in this, and of course this is what economists do, right? You talk about it in this one general way: output.
Yes.
Stuff we do.
Exactly.
And I think, is all output created equal? Of course it's not. Isn't some output counterproductive in the end? In other words, doesn't it matter greatly what that action is, that product, that service, whatever the output is, right? Whatever value we're creating. I learned in business school that value really usually means one thing, or traditionally has, which is a bummer. Trying to work on redefining that. But is the kind of output that's related to creating much more pollution or inequality, for example, obviously, like, it seems like it should be counted differently than output that leads to greater wellness for people and planet. Can you talk to me just a little bit about that? A little bit about how we think about what we measure, how we measure it, what's worth measuring. I know these are big questions, but I want to ask you all the big
Absolutely.
questions, the big kind of cheesy, what's it all mean questions.
Right. So
I see the numbers and I understand, but I wonder what will allow what will allow all of us to sort of continue to evolve and wake up to these bigger truths and to the opportunity that we have.
when I look at the dates of these ages of globalization, uh, after this first dispersal, the next fundamental change of human life is sedentary life as farmers, the Neolithic revolution, the birth of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And then I talk about another major technological breakthrough, basically the automobile age of 3000 BC with the domestication of the horse, and how fundamental the horse was in changing everything about scale of human activity, productivity, transport, communication, obviously, and all the rest. How that gave way to the large empires that we regard as the iconic empires, the Roman Empire, the Han Empire, and so forth. And then the breakthroughs that I just mentioned of the ocean age, the discovery of the sea routes, the fact that with ocean-based navigation, you can move goods and people, including, alas, slaves, but people at very low cost compared to the costs of moving goods and services and people over land. And suddenly there was a worldwide economy taking shape. So one can consider the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s to be the birth of the modern capitalist integrated world. And I emphasize it's not that pleasant a picture because it was occasioned, as in many of these transitions, with incredible violence and in incredible view by the conquering societies of their God-given and innate superiority, and therefore their God-given rights to plunder, to kill, to destroy other civilizations, to create genocides, to enslave, and so on. The period you're referring to is the sixth of the seven ages of globalization. It's the birth of the industrial age, which, even more than the other periods, is really the remarkable fruits of one huge breakthrough, and that is the steam engine, which suddenly enabled humanity to mobilize energy, and specifically fossil fuel energy, coal, oil, and natural gas, on a scale that was simply, literally in every way beyond imagining and beyond possibilities beforehand. So economic historians distinguish between the organic economy, which is basically what we can make with our hands or with animal power, and with wind in sails and wind in mills and water in water mills. But that adds a little bit. It doesn't change that much. And what could be done in the steam age, which then became the age of the internal combustion engine and the age of the gas turbine. So there is a breakthrough that took us in 200 years from almost everywhere living at near subsistence, almost everywhere living still in rural communities, something hard for us to think about because if we're lucky to visit Paris or Beijing or Rome, you think that civilization is urbanity. It's great cities and great cities of the past. But in fact, only 10% or much fewer or much less of the world population lived in cities up until the industrial age. And countries that urbanized early, like the Netherlands and the UK, were extraordinary outliers. And in fact, the UK got to industrialization first also made that little island of Britain take over the world because it got to industrial scale power ahead of its near rivals, in fact. So all of this is to say there was a deep transformation in every aspect of life that we need to understand is only around 2 centuries old, that took global society from essentially pervasive and seemingly perpetual subsistence or poverty to our current state on average of global wealth, and to a remarkable decline in extreme deprivation from what was near universal, maybe 80 to 90% of the world population, down to something less than 10% today, and in a context in which the world population increased tenfold. Quite remarkable. And it was as late as 1798 that Robert Thomas Malthus was writing in his work, The Principles of Population, that we would never escape from poverty because we could never keep ahead of the rise of population that would drive living standards back down to subsistence. But here, as Malthus said, the rise of productivity did spur a tenfold rise of global population. But on top of that was a hundredfold, roughly, increase of output, meaning 10 times per person by the end of this period. Now, the question you pose, what does that all mean in terms of well-being, is actually something I was writing exactly today. What may have made sense philosophically, and I'm writing a little bit about the philosophy of economics right now, what may have made sense philosophically in 1776, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, that wealth would be the goal, made sense in a world of scarcity.
Sure.
But now we are in a world of wealth. You could say, by the way, with incredible crimes along the way, with incredible suffering along the way, with incredible inequality along the way, and still with this striking, shocking, completely unnecessary fact that there still is 10% of the world's population with extreme deprivation, and no reason for that at all, as you know well, and as I've seen with my own eyes. We're no longer in a world of scarcity. We are in a world of wealth. So we need a new philosophy. We don't
I loved
need.
how you said today, if he was writing today, it would be the wealth of sustainable development of nations, right?
Well, what I'm proposing in the shorthand is the well-being of nations rather than the wealth of nations, because the basic idea of the ethical underpinnings of our lives and the ethical underpinnings of economics is ethics in its true sense is not do this, do that. It's what's good for us, good for us as human beings. And Aristotle, who invented the science of ethics, said ethics is the way to achieve happiness. And that's what our politics and economics should be about. Adam Smith, who was also a moralist and a very great humanist, he wrote The Wealth of Nations to promote wealth. And looked at now, we shouldn't be trapped in that concept for exactly the reason you said. But going back to 1776, it's pretty plausible as a shorthand that more was really a good idea. And what happened in the history of philosophy, which many people have sorted out and thought about, is the odd part that throughout most of Western history, philosophers railed against avarice and accumulation of wealth as something that was not for the human good. But they were, in a way, speaking about static economies and static societies. So greed and accumulation was almost surely a zero-sum struggle. Somebody getting rich meant automatically somebody getting poor. To Adam Smith's basic motivation in The Wealth of Nations, he recognized rightly that he was living at a time when you could have more without somebody having less. It didn't always work that way because a lot of accumulation was based on slavery, for example. So that was really a terrible case of negative sum or at least zero sum struggle. But a lot of what Smith argued, and that what really came to be the case in the 19th and 20th centuries, is you could have more without anybody having less because our technologies were getting smarter and smarter. But fast forward to where we are right now, your question is extremely pertinent for many, many reasons. One is the idea that, well, there's an endless frontier to accumulate. That's wrong. We've reached our limits. We've reached physical limits. We're destroying the planet by what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
That was not the case 200 years ago. We didn't really understand, of course. Well, we did understand, I should emphasize, by the way, as early as 1896, scientists understood that the fossil fuel age had this twist to it, that it was going to start to warm the planet. They didn't necessarily realize in that first inkling that this was going to be a huge danger, but already we've known for decades that's a kind of planetary boundary, that more is not good. We just have bad accounting right now. We think we're getting wealthy, we're actually destroying the planet. So that's one part. But the second part is maybe in a way, I don't want to overdo it, but you could justify avarice and greed if it leads to accumulation that adds to a bigger pie that eases this scarcity that humanity has suffered for so long. But today, it's clearly not the case that it's absolutely vital for the United States to add the next percent of GDP. That's absurd. We have so much wealth. I mean, by the way, even unimaginable amounts of individual wealth. And we have the ability to solve our problems of deprivation. It's actually, in a way, our ethos, which is blocking us more than anything right now, because our ethos of rugged individualism or get what you can, which may have made sense in the age of accumulation of wealth, is highly detrimental now when our problem is not wealth. Our problem is social connectedness. Our problem is ability to cooperate with each other, the need for trust with each other. Our society, sad to say, in the United States is falling apart. And one of the reasons it's falling apart actually is that our ethics right now are really for a different era. We need, and one of the things I'm arguing is we need to go back to Aristotle, to Jesus's teachings, to other uh, uh, ancient wisdom ethics because they were about social connectedness. They were about justice. They
Yeah.
were about deeper meaning than wealth. Maybe, again, just to beat it dead, you could excuse the focus on wealth accumulation if you are able thereby to escape from poverty. But we long ago escaped from poverty. Really, our challenge of a good life is something very different. And the fact that the United States simply cannot solve any major problem right now. We can't stop a pandemic. We can't face our profound social inequalities in an honest way. We can't make a budget that is decent for the common good. All of this is a sign of something wrong with our ethics more than anything else. It's not wrong with our wealth creating mechanisms. It's something about how we view our role in the world.
Mhm.
To bring it back to the book, geography, technology, institutions are about ideas, about how we organize our lives, about the philosophy that we live by. And we need, because we are in a new age right now, we need a new ethics that is still true to human well being and human nature, but at least is up to date with planetary realities. What are those? That we're global, that we're interconnected, that it doesn't, that we are not the be all and end all of the planet, one country, one race, one anything. We are 7.8 billion people really packed together tightly now. And wealth accumulation is not our major struggle by far.
So, I mean, I want to ask you a million questions. That my job is very hard today because there's so much here. I have to say, I think it was all the way back in chapter 1 of the book ish, where you quote Weber and you talk about institutions and political institutions, political rules, and how there's this very deep connection with once the state is organized, it has a quote monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. I mean, it took my breath away because I've read this stuff before, but not right now, given the context, right? Given what we are just watching unfold around us with Black Lives Matter, with this global conversation happening right now about the abuses of police force. So a theme that I love that you bring up again and again in the book, and that you're talking about a little bit now, is look back to go forward, right? To be able to know what to do next and how to solve some of our problems. So in it can be you can take your pick here, but part of me wants to ask on this particular issue, right? Was there a time in which you think force, power, and and the connection that it had uh, with the formation, the organization of a state, right? Of a community, if I can be that touchy feely about it.
Yep.
Are there other times that you think of that you think it was done better then? Here's how we could do it better now, looking to that example. Kind of one
Right.
way I want to ask about it. But in general, if you want to make it a broader theme, go
So,
for it. This is your show. As you think about the ethics that are so lacking today, I know given you can't just go pull what worked at one period in time and recycle it and use it again now, but where can we look for inspiration? What can we borrow? What can we adapt? When did it work best? Do you think? When were the ethics in line with the reality of the world in which people were living, if
when
ever?
when when Weber talks about the state as the place of the monopoly of the legitimate monopoly of force, he's not really saying that the state has uh, the right to use force or that the state is based on force, but he is saying that the state should not face competition for legitimate force, and it's really a claim about what can make for a peaceful society. Now, in what context could the state be the locus of legitimate force or power, and things work out well for the people in that society.
Yeah.
That question is the age-old question of politics, and probably the best answer to it, just like the best answer to ethics, was given in the first book of political science ever written by Aristotle in the Politics. And that was 2,300 years ago, roughly. What I love about Aristotle's view of politics is that he says it's self-evident that what is politics? Politics is about the action of the community for the good of the people in the community. The Greek idea of the good is eudaimonia, and the idea of politics is to organize the polis, the city-state of Aristotle's time, for the eudaimonia of the people. What a wonderful idea. And how far it is from our idea of politics right now.
Yeah.
Our idea of politics is much closer to Machiavelli's idea, written in, I think, first manuscript form in 1514, that 500 years ago that I mentioned as being such a dramatic time. Machiavelli, by the way, was deeply steeped in classical philosophy and was a wonderful historian and scholar, but he wrote what we know of as a very cynical handbook that views politics as power. Politics is a game. It's a game of power. And the prince should do what the prince needs to do to hold on to power. It's a very bleak picture. And it is unfortunately a closer picture to American politics right now than Aristotle's vision of politics as being the way that a political community pursues the common good and pursues happiness. So what Machiavelli gave us was something rather dark. Now, interestingly, of course, our roots of political thinking follow the British line of thinking. And Hobbes, in writing in the midst of the English civil wars of the middle of the 17th century, has the idea that what human beings need is kind of a Weberian monopoly of power, which Hobbes calls the Leviathan. He was writing at a time of civil war, and for him, absolutely the highest aspiration was not happiness. In fact, he didn't really believe in happiness. He believed that people were insatiably pursuing fame and insatiably pursuing wealth, so they couldn't have any happiness. They were inevitably colliding with each other. And Hobbes said, in a state of nature, they'd kill each other. Life would be short and brutish. So Hobbes said the only way to stop people from doing damage to each other was to have an all-powerful state. Now, the point I'd like to emphasize is that Aristotle had a much brighter picture of human beings. He didn't have a fuzzy-headed idea that humanity was all good and it was all touchy-feely and we all love each other. He had the idea that there were two sides of human nature. For him, a kind of animalistic, instinctual nature, and a higher nature, which was based on our unique capacity to reason. So Aristotle said that humankind's highest calling was cultivation of reason, that as a reasoning being, that was our telos, that was our purpose. And he believed that we could live in a civil society, we could live as political animals in the polis, in the city-state, peacefully, if we would restrain our animalistic side and promote our rational side. And he said that politics should be about instruction in virtue, in well-being. We should teach good manners. We should teach sociability. We should teach self-restraint. We should teach the idea of the common good. we should teach the virtues, is how the Greeks put it, arete, or the excellences of character. And that has a lot of appeal to me, actually. So Hobbes is a very bleak picture. Machiavelli is a very cynical picture. Aristotle is a very realistic picture, in my mind, of the two sides of human nature. Now, for Aristotle, it was a little bit easier. He lived in Athens. He actually had to flee Athens for his life. It was not so simple. He knew the world wasn't so simple. But what do we do in this global world? 7.8 billion people. And humanity is not touchy-feely that we all love each other. It is nice to think, but it's not so easy to realize, even within our communities, much less across the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of our really big practical challenge is, can we find a common ethical base for pursuing the common good that overcomes what is, I believe, an instinctive, even evolutionarily built in us versus them mentality that contributes to our instinctive nature, good for me, not for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that I regard as so much of our problem, and where rationality should overcome instinct in this way. We're pretty deeply, I think, hardwired to hate the other, unfortunately. It seems that that is uh, one of the outcomes of evolution on the African savannah, where different small bands of humans competed with each other for turf and for survival. And we probably are an embodiment of that ancient struggle. And it reminds me, Jessica, of I think a very important general guidepost for all of us is a saying of my great guru in evolutionary biology, E.O. Wilson at Harvard, who's one of the gifts to this world in knowledge and insight. He says, we've stumbled into the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our
Mm-hmm.
medieval institutions, and our near godlike technologies. And what is so pertinent about this, first of all, is the interplay of human nature, institutions, and technology. So we're exactly aligned on that. But
Right.
what Wilson is emphasizing is that they don't run on the same speed. And we have to understand. And the more we understand, the more we can appreciate this asynchronous reality, that we have some very deep and unsettling ideas and instincts and feelings about the world that are probably really deeply part of the human species. We have institutions like our Constitution, which was made in 1789, absolutely brilliant then, but I wouldn't start with a lot of it now. If we were doing it over again, it has led to certain pretty deep seated problems in our country. And technology is racing ahead at the rate of Moore's Law, doubling every year or two. Our human nature is not doubling every year or two in understanding. Our institutions are not keeping up. And yet we're now in the digital age.
I mean, that quote, it's like you couldn't have designed it better to line up. I loved the several quotes throughout the book of E.O. Wilson. I would like, since we're a little over halfway through, I would like to look at some of the audience questions, but
Right?
selfishly, I'm going to reserve the right to kind of weave one little part of my own question into it as well. When you talk about just now, we can't go start over and rewrite the Constitution, but if we would today, what would it look like? How would it be different? Knowing what we know, being who we are today. So I'm telling you again and again, I was nodding along, relating to so much in the book, including like weird stuff I didn't anticipate relating to. Like, for example, way back in the way back Paleolithic age, talking about clans and these small foraging bands, I guess I should say, of 20 to 30 members. I'm thinking, that's like the size of my quarantine pod almost.
There you are.
And I was thinking, like, what can I learn? What can I learn from how they did things? What was working, what wasn't? I feel like in a lot of ways, this strange moment with COVID is allowing us to, in a very personal way, all of us take a breath and sort of rebuild, kind of the way that we interact with the world, right? So with that, my selfish sort of thread in this next question, one of our audience members is asking, saying diseases and pandemics have shaped history. Of course, smallpox, bubonic plague, et cetera. And you go through a lot of those. How do you think the COVID pandemic right now will reshape or could reshape the future?
Yeah, we are being reminded of all sorts of things. Before I get to COVID, I actually wanted to just encourage all of us to think about that question. What would we do in political design? Because I think it's actually a very interesting question. I just wanted to mention a couple of thoughts about that and then turn to the pandemic. I would definitely not have a president. This is the starting point. We do not need this single executive, especially in the United States, that combines two roles that almost in every other decent place right now is separated, which is head of state and head of government. In almost all countries now, in constitutional dispensations, there's either a monarch who is a constitutional monarch that is the head of state, Queen Elizabeth, or the King and Queen of Sweden, and so forth. And they embody a national pride, a national history, and don't get involved in day-to-day politics. The head of government runs the executive branch and is typically in constitutional monarchies the prime minister now. So it's an executive that is beholden to a parliament and can lose a vote of confidence, which would be a really nice thing if we had that, because who could have confidence in the nut that we have as president right now? Nobody should. So in our country, they had the model of the king, King George. They didn't want a king, although there was some flirtation with the king among some of the more monarchically oriented of the founding fathers. But they needed an executive, so they created the president as both the head of state and head of government. It's too much. It's too powerful. And as the U.S. became an empire and became a globe-straddling military superpower, we invested far too much power in one person. And thanks God, most of the time, the people in that position were somewhat normal or close to normal or even normal and sometimes gifted. But now we have really, in my view, a clinical case as president, and it's extraordinarily dangerous. How does he govern? He governs by executive decree almost entirely. And it's one, and what we're learning, I didn't really appreciate it, how many times the word emergency or national security appears throughout our national legislation, giving the president extraordinary powers in what are supposed to be extraordinary circumstances. But if you have an autocrat like Trump, who sees everything as an emergency or claims everything to be an emergency, you grab power in an unbelievable way. So this man is able single-handedly to do absolutely horrible things. And you have to remind yourself every now and then, hey, we're supposed to be a democracy. And the only thing that holds Trump back, practically speaking, right now, are the courts on occasion, but not systematically enough, especially since he's appointed 200 judges that are going to have a very, very typically pro-executive power outlook. So this is where I would start. But I'd also like to raise another idea, because I hope that people listening online will take it forward better. In 1789, not everyone, of course, could go to Washington. So we had the idea of republicanism, of representative government, partly out of a normative thought that representatives would be specialists trained in politics, trained in legislation, and out of the practical point that somebody had to decide. And in a country spread out along the Atlantic seaboard, it couldn't be uh, the self-governance of Swiss cantons. We were larger than that already back in 1789. It would have to be representatives taking a long journey to a single location to do the business of the nation, and that became Washington. Well, now we easily interact. Uh, I really kind of wonder about the role of Congress also. So I'd like to get rid of the presidency. I wonder what we really need representatives for exactly. Now, the argument against direct democracy is about its uh, potentially radical and dangerous nature, swings of whim, and so forth. So arguments against direct democracy date back to before uh, Aristotle's time, actually, and were already discussed by Aristotle at length. And the idea of government by the demos was the people was already a charged idea. So I don't necessarily mean uh, the downsides, but I wonder what could we do through truly online group activities. Why should legislation be written in the middle of the night by corporate lobbyists rather than being posted and worked on like a Wikipedia page, which is actually, on average, a remarkably good uh, source of information? I don't know how exactly it doesn't get distorted more often, but it's a pretty darn reliable source of information for
Yeah.
an unbelievable amount of entries. What if we worked on legislation on police reform or any other topic as a society? People could post their essays, their expertise. We could have witnesses that the whole country sees. We could have people propose phrasing, ideas, and approaches that the rest of us could weigh in on. Uh, I think we would find ways to express the common good vastly more effectively than we do now. And I'm, in general, a technophile and a techno optimist, although the whole book is filled with the fact that you can militarize anything under the sun, including, obviously, artificial intelligence and online. And every day we're filled with the debates about that. But I am, in general, a believer that the new technology should allow for an e-governance in a way that we haven't had before. And I'd like to get on with some attempts at that and some experimentation uh, at the national level, certainly at the state and local level, to try to demonstrate the case. Now, that segues into COVID-19. Uh, First, we don't know how long this disease is going to last and how uh, deeply it is going to disrupt societies, for two reasons. If one of the 100 or so vaccines that's under development now really proves to be highly effective, that will truncate the pandemic. And let's hope that that's the case. Uh, I would say the most optimistic views about that are hype rather than reality, that within a couple of months, you could immunize billions of people. We would never know the safety of what we're doing on such an approach, and it would be a reckless rush to do something like that. So it's going to take time. But what it could also prove to be the case, as it has been with HIV, that we had a Secretary of Health and Human Services in 1983, Margaret Heckler, who said, we're going to have a vaccine by the fall. And that was 37 years ago, and we don't have a vaccine in sight. So we don't even know whether there will ever be a vaccine, much less what's claimed and hyped in 2021. Now, saying that, there's a lot about the virus we don't know, and we're not controlling it also. And American society is proving to be pretty damn obstreperous and difficult. And we even politicize face masks. Are you kidding? What is wrong with this country that face masks became a left-right issue? It's, of course, in large part because we have excuse me for saying it, but I believe a psychopath as president who has basically created as much hate and division as he possibly can as his mode of behavior and mode of governing. But we're a very difficult country right now that we can't even physically distance, wear a face mask, and keep this under control. And it's become a matter of fundamental rights, as if people have a fundamental right to cough on someone or to spread a virus. And people are apparently not much aware that the face mask is first and foremost a protection to other people, not even to yourself. So it's just good etiquette. It's just good decency. Of course, it's also self-protective as well. Now, what I'm seeing, watching the data as others are, so many countries in the world are absolutely not controlling this virus. And a lot of them are ruled by Trumplets, like Brazil. Bolsonaro is a horrible president, actually, with all of the instincts of Trump, nationalistic, anti-science, lots of bravado, terrible examples. And Brazil is having a fulminant runaway pandemic right now. Mexico, with its own populist leader, is having a runaway epidemic right now. So this is the next point that I would say. How deep and transformative this is depends on how we act, because this is a controllable virus, but we're not controlling it. How do I know it's controllable? Because China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand have all controlled it. Not perfectly, but they have such a few cases that when the inevitable new outbreaks come, they're able to contain them, to suppress them. So if the whole world behaved that way, with rationality, with cooperation, with exchange of best practices, we'd be over this in 3 months, because each place would suppress the epidemic. We would then bolster that control with public health teams, testing, monitoring, and we get through this. But we're not doing that. So that's the next peculiar reality. This is going to be painful because governance is so lousy right now in so many places, including our own country. Then the longer this goes on, the more threats to basic world order. People are suffering. Poor people are out of jobs. They've lost remittance income. They're losing their ability to stay in perhaps countries where they are working on visas or temporary stays. So there are a lot of crises that are building up, a lot of financial pressures, a lot of debts of the public sector in almost every country in the world. The failure to control the virus means that we're deepening the economic impacts and the shadow that this will have on the future.
Yeah.
Two more points I would make. The Asia Pacific, on average, has done vastly better than the North Atlantic. So the North Atlantic means us and Canada and Mexico on the western side of the Atlantic, and it means Western Europe on the other side. And by and large, all of us, the rich, advanced, sophisticated countries, failed to suppress the epidemic early on, And many of the countries, notably the US and the UK, as two of those countries with similar politics right now, are still in an ongoing wave of infection. In the Asia Pacific, as I mentioned earlier, most of the countries have suppressed the virus. And they've done it in a pretty sophisticated manner, actually, with a lot of digital technologies, a lot of creativity, a lot of know how, and a lot of much tighter social organization, a Confucian culture, I would say, rather than I get to do whatever I want culture uh, of America. So this means that the geopolitics is really pushing even the faster rise of East Asia. And that already was a mark of this new age of globalization. We're past uh, the American century. We are into a multipolar world where East Asia plays a larger and larger role. Very complicated set of issues because East Asia is not so harmonious amongst themselves. But if they looked at what's happening right now, they'd say, hey, we can cooperate together. We don't know what's happening on the other side of the world, but at least we have the epidemic under control. The last point about this epidemic, obviously, is that it has pushed us headlong into the digital economy, a trend that was completely underway, but in 12 weeks has accelerated to what might have taken 5 to 10 years otherwise. How many businesses have I talked to, and I'm sure everyone has this experience, where people said, oh my God, I didn't realize we could do 80% of our work from home. We're never going to go back to the office the way we were before.
Mm.
This is happening everywhere. Uh, and it means that the jobs of the future are absolutely changing before our eyes in a way that only a mega war would have done in the past. Within a few weeks, we're redefining the workplace.
Right.
We're redefining the office. We're redefining how we interact, how we work together, how teams work together, uh, how government provides services, uh, how we expect our goods to arrive. Mind you, of course, it's a cliche. All of this was happening beforehand, but the acceleration of it has
Yeah.
made people realize the tools that we have. Now, in general, I like it. Uh, I don't like not being able to go in to see colleagues, but 1 or 2 days a week is going to be fine with me. Not 5 days a week. It already was fine with
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
before. And I think if we make something good of this, uh, we can make for more leisure time, for less commuting time, for more quality interactions when we are together. But we should understand that it has created an unbelievable amount of inequality as well in a short period of time. People
Right.
with online applicable skills have their jobs, they have their incomes, they have their daily routines, they have their Zooms from morning till night. Uh, People who are working in shops, doing local services, frontline responders, and so forth, have lost incomes, have faced infections, don't have the luxuries of the generally much higher paid workers,
Mm.
and don't have an easy answer right now. And a lot of people have lost their wealth. And on the other hand, Jeffrey Bezos has gained about $50 billion in net
Yeah.
worth since the start of the year. So these are real issues for our society going forward.
I hear you. I mean, it was a fantastic question, and I'm glad that it was asked, and I'm glad that it was answered. And I can't believe this, and I hate to do it, but our time is just about over. I wanted to cite one thing as we close. There was, I guess it was in the classical age section of the book. You talked about how there was this awareness, this consciousness that the participants themselves felt that they were writing the history of humanity. And I felt like that maybe above so much else, that for me is something I'm going to take away, and that I hope we can all take away, that that's actually a truth